Picture the first hunter-gatherers in Europe. You probably see pale skin, blue eyes, a fur coat in the snow. For decades, that is exactly what the textbook showed you. Then, scientists in London read all the DNA in a 10,000-year-old skeleton, and half of that picture turned out to be wrong, which raised a stranger question. If the first hunter-gatherers were not who we thought, then who, out of everyone alive today, carries the most of their old DNA? The answer shocked the people who found it. To see why that answer hit like a small earthquake, you have to start with a problem that sounds impossible. How do you read a DNA code that went silent 10,000 years ago? For most of the last 100 years, you couldn't. DNA is easy to break. The moment a body stops living, its DNA starts to fall apart, breaking into smaller and smaller pieces, mixed with germs, with dirt, and with bits from everyone who ever touched the bone. For decades, old DNA was seen as a lost cause, a graveyard for careers, and the early tries made it look that way. In the 90s, labs said they had DNA from dinosaur bones, from bugs stuck in amber, from Egyptian mummies. The headlines were amazing. Almost all of it turned out to be a mix-up. Newer DNA from the scientists themselves leaking into the sample. The lesson was harsh. If you wanted to read the deep past, you first had to prove you were not just reading yourself. Then a Swedish scientist named Svante Pääbo spent years refusing to believe that. Working out of the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, Germany, he and his team built ways careful enough to pull real, old human DNA out of old bone and tell it apart from newer DNA mixing in. In 2022, he won the Nobel Prize in Medicine for it. He had basically built a time machine out of chemistry. And what that machine found, almost right away, hinted at the answer to come. When Pääbo's team read all the DNA of a Neanderthal, a whole different kind of human that vanished around 40,000 years ago, they found something that should not have been there. Nearly everyone alive today, everyone whose family left Africa, carries a small bit of Neanderthal DNA, a percent or two, woven right into us. Our ancestors had not just met other humans, they had mixed with them. That one finding was a warning shot to every tidy story about pure, separate family lines. But the big win that blew this whole field wide open was almost funny how exact it was. In 2015, a scientist named Ron Pinhasi found that one certain bone in the human skull, the hard Petrous bone that wraps around the inner ear, keeps DNA far better than anything else in the body. It is the hardest bone we have, and inside it, the DNA code can last for tens of thousands of years, safe from the rot. Think about that for a second. The thing that lets us reach back into the deep past is a tiny chip of bone the size of a fingertip hidden behind your ear. Add radiocarbon dating, which tells you how old the bone is in the first place, and you have a full toolkit. Drill into the Petrous bone when things are right, and the bones start talking. In barely 10 years, the world went from a handful of old DNA samples to more than 10,000 of them. A whole hidden history, all at once, ready to read. So that is exactly what scientists did. And the first skeleton to really shake the public was a man pulled out of a cave in southwest England more than 100 years earlier. His name, or the name we gave him, is Cheddar Man. He was found in 1903 in Gough's Cave, in Cheddar Gorge, Somerset. He is the oldest full human skeleton ever found in Britain, about 10,000 years old. For over 100 years, he sat in the Natural History Museum, and for most of that time, everyone just figured he looked pretty much like a modern white Englishman. The models of his face gave him pale skin. It just seemed clear. In 2018, a team led by Selena Brace and Ian Barnes at the Natural History Museum, working with the gene scientist Mark Thomas at University College London, did something nobody had pulled off before. They read all his DNA from that Petrous bone. The results stopped people cold. Cheddar Man, one of Britain's first hunter-gatherers, almost surely had dark skin, dark to black, going by the DNA markers, and at the same time, blue eyes, dark, curly hair, a mix almost no one alive looks like today. This is the part that still gets me. The people who hunted across Ice Age Europe, who painted the caves, who lived through a frozen world, did not look the way we drew them for 200 years. The pale skin we think of as old and European is, in the long story of our bodies, fairly new. It spread far and wide only later, and a good chunk of it was brought in by people coming from somewhere else. When the face model went public in 2018, with its deep brown skin and pale blue eyes, it set off fights that had nothing to do with science. But the bone did not care about any of that. The markers were the markers, and they were pointing at a picture of the European past that the old drawings had quietly gotten wrong for generations. Cheddar men belonged to a group scientists now call the Western hunter-gatherers. They had spread across the continent after the last ice age. Dark-skinned, light-eyed, living off the land. For a few thousand years, they basically were Europe. And then, they almost completely disappeared. Not in a war we can point to, not in a single sickness with a name, something quieter, and in a way, stranger. This is where the story takes a turn almost no one outside the science world has heard. To see what happened, go back to a 2014 study in the journal Nature, led by Iosif Lazaridis and the Harvard gene scientist David Reich. They compared old DNA against living Europeans and found something that flipped the simple story. Modern Europeans are not the straight, unbroken children of those hunter-gatherers. They are a mix of three very different old peoples. First, the Western hunter-gatherers, Cheddar man's people. Second, a wave of early farmers who came out of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, starting around 8,000 years ago, bringing wheat, farm animals, and a whole different way of living. And third, a group that showed up later and changed everything. Around 5,000 years ago, herders swept in from the open grasslands north of the Black Sea, the Pontic-Caspian steppe. Scientists call them the Yamnaya. A 2015 study in Nature, led by Wolfgang Hauck, showed just how huge their move was. They poured west across the land on tamed horses and wagons, and they left their DNA almost everywhere they went. And they did not just bring new roots, they brought new bodies. The genes for lighter skin spread across Europe mostly through these later waves, the farmers and the herders, not the first hunter-gatherers. Being able to drink milk as a grown-up, something most of the world still cannot do, came in with the milk-drinking peoples over the last few thousand years. Much of what we now think of as a typical European look is younger than the pyramids. In some places, the swap was huge. A 2018 study, led by Inigo Olalde, looked at Britain on its own, around the time a people called the Bell Beaker arrived. Within a few hundred years, they had swapped out close to 90% of the island's DNA pattern. Cheddar man's people, those dark-skinned hunter-gatherers, were almost fully written over. Let that number breathe for a moment. 9 and 10. The first hunter-gatherer roots of Britain did not gently blend into the people there now. They were mostly swept aside. So, this is the awkward part of the popular story. When people picture the deep European past and see themselves as the heirs of proud cave-dwelling hunters, the DNA tells a messier truth. The hunter-gatherer in the average modern European's DNA is real, but it is the smallest of the three parts. A small share, a ghost. The farmers and the steppe herders did most of the writing, which leaves the question from the very beginning still hanging, now sharper than ever. If Europe's hunter-gatherers were mostly written over, then who on Earth today carries the most of that old first hunter-gatherer DNA? Because someone has to. If a story like this is your kind of thing, the past cracked open by science, take 1 second and subscribe. It really helps this channel keep digging. Now, back to the question. To answer it, you have to stop looking at Europe at all and pull all the way back to the place where the whole human story begins, Africa. Every person alive comes from people who lived in Africa. Our species, Homo sapiens, took shape there. And for almost all of the time we have been around, hundreds of thousands of years, every single human was a hunter-gatherer. Farming is the new thing. It is the odd one out. The hunter-gatherer is the rule, the starting point we all came from. So, the deepest hunter-gatherer roots should not be a new thing anywhere. They should be the oldest, the closest to the root of the family tree. And when gene scientists went looking for that root, the trail led to southern Africa, to the people often known as the San, or the Khoisan. In 2017, a study in the journal Science, led by Carina Schlebusch and Matthias Jakobsen at Uppsala University in Sweden, read old and living DNA from this part of the world. What they found pushed the start date of our species further back. The family line of the San seems to have split off from other humans somewhere between 260,000 and 350,000 years ago. Read that again, because it is hard to hold in your head. Cheddar man is 10,000 years old. The San line branches off the rest of humans more than 250,000 years ago. They are not a side branch on the human tree. By the DNA, they sit closer to the first trunk than almost anyone else alive. And there is more. Going back to work led by the gene scientist Sarah Tishkoff in 2009, also published in Science, scientists found that African groups carry the most genetic variety on the planet. The San in particular hold a depth of difference that groups outside Africa just do not have. Because everyone who left Africa carried only a small part of that variety out with them. Here is how one-sided that is. Among southern African hunter-gatherer groups, Two people from nearby villages can carry more DNA difference between them than a person from Europe carries compared to a person from East Asia. All of that difference we spread across the whole rest of the world is, in a way, a thin slice taken off the top of what stayed behind in Africa. And the sand kept living the old way long enough that scientists who study people back in the 1900s could still write it down. The tracking, the hunting and gathering, the click languages that are among the oldest sounds in human speech. Not a museum display, a living thread, unbroken. Put the pieces together, and the answer to our question stops being European at all. The people who carry the deepest, oldest, most unbroken thread of hunter-gatherer roots are not the ones in the old textbook drawings. They are groups like the San of the Kalahari, who, amazingly, lived as hunter-gatherers right up into recent times, holding on to a way of life that is, in a real way, the closest living link to how every one of our ancestors once lived. The gene scientists had run the numbers, expecting a tidy ranking. What they got instead was a finding that quietly took the whole question apart. Because what those numbers really show is bigger than any single group. The question, which race carries the most hunter-gatherer DNA, sounds simple. It takes for granted that the world splits into a few neat race boxes, and that one of them is the true heir of the old hunters. But that is not what the DNA says. Every living human comes from hunter-gatherers. All of us. The way of life that shaped our bodies, our brains, our gut feelings, was the hunter-gatherer way. For more than 95% of the time our species has been around. What the old DNA keeps showing, study after study, is that human history is not a set of separate, pure family lines. It is non-stop mixing. Hunter-gatherers, farmers, herders, meeting, blending, replacing, blending, again. The dark-skinned hunter-gatherer in the European past, the Anatolian farmer, the steppe rider, the deep African root older than all of them. They all sit inside the modern story, just in different amounts, in different places. And the people who might be called the most direct living link to that first hunter-gatherer world, the San, are not a leftover from the past, and they are not backward. Hunter-gatherer does not mean simple. It was the most successful way to survive in all of human history, the one that carried us through ice ages and droughts and hundreds of thousands of years before a single seed was ever planted on purpose. So when scientists tested which people carry the most hunter-gatherer DNA, the honest answer was not a winner in a race. It was a mirror. The deepest roots run through Africa. The branches run through every one of us. And the tidy race groups the question took for granted turned out to be far newer, far fuzzier, and far less real than the bones sitting in that museum drawer. That is the part the headlines never quite catch. Think back to that skull in the London Museum. 10,000 years in a cave, 100 years in a drawer, and then a tiny bit of bone behind the ear, rewriting what we thought we knew about ourselves. A dark-skinned, blue-eyed hunter whose people were nearly erased, telling us, across all that time, that the past is stranger and more tied together than the story we were handed. We used to dig up bones and guess. Now we read them, letter by letter. And almost every time we do, the same lesson comes back. The line between us and them, between this people and that one, is thinner than anyone wanted to believe. If you want to see what old DNA showed about the very first humans to leave Africa, and the cousins we met along the way, that story is waiting on the screen right now. Go find out who else is hiding in your blood.